you would please introduce yourself first, maybe talk a little bit about your expertise and your research.
Yeah, my name is Rolf Mueller. I'm a professor at Virginia Tech in the Department of Mechanical Engineering, and I also have an adjunct position in electrical and computer engineering. I direct the University Center for Bio-Inspired Science and Technology. I have a pretty interdisciplinary background. I started out in biology and neuroscience, became then interested in signal processing, robotics, that ultimately landed me in a mechanical engineering department. And so I have been building robots that replicate the sonar sensing and recently also the flying of bats, and that has kept me busy over the years.
Okay, good. Yeah, I think that's where a lot of research is going with engineering and physics. They're kind of moving into the bio space, right? So there's a lot to do there. Okay, good. So I want to talk about some of your research and just some basic physics and biology about how we hear things and our ears, and in particular bats, and how they do all the cool stuff that they do. Cool. So this is, I have already done a podcast on human voice, so we have some understanding, but I do want this to be a standalone.
Yeah, I mean, human voice is a very good connection to what the biological model that I study bats do, right? So the bats with sophisticated sonar, they produce ultrasonic pulses, and it's pretty much like we produce speech, right? So there are vibrating cords, the vocal cords, that act as the source for the sound. And then there is a vocal tract that acts as a filter. And then the sound, so if the bats have options, right? So for humans, the sound that you create with your vocal folds, it travels through your vocal tract, and then it comes out of the mouth. And in the bats, it depends. So in some bats, it comes out of the mouth, just like it does for us. But in the most sophisticated bats, they speak through the nose, right? So in these cases, the sound comes out of the nostrils. And you can actually see, when you look the bat in the face, you can tell where the sound is coming out, right? Not because you can see the sound, you cannot obviously, but you can see that because the bats that emit the sound through the nostrils, they have like a little megaphone around the nostril. The biologists call that a nose sleeve, and it is like a little megaphone, right? So the sound comes out of these tiny nostrils, so that's a little bit like a point source. And then they have these baffles that act like a megaphone to project the sound then out and forward.
Okay, good. So yeah, let's go back just to some basic physics and talk about why sound is a wave, how we can kind of think about it, and maybe talk about like volume, because maybe that's not so intuitive to people. And volume is, yeah, so when we're talking about hearing in particular, our hearing has an incredible range of sensitivity to volume. So let's get into a little bit of that to discuss sort of.
Yeah, so all the sensing that the bats do with their biosonar system, it is wave-based, right? So what they're doing is they push their vocal folds, right? They push against the air, and they create a little local compression of the air molecules. And then again, the membrane, the vocal fold will swing the other way, and then they create an area where the pressure is reduced, right? And that up and down, it propagates through the air and away from the bat. Just like if you have you throw a stone in the pond, right? You get these circular waves, only that this happens in 3D, not in 2D, like on the surface of the pond, but it is essentially the same thing, right? So you get a wave that spreads out from the bat, but then the bats have these structures like the nose leaf that I mentioned, those megaphones, right, where they direct the energy, right? So unlike if you throw a stone nicely symmetrically in the pond, right, the amplitude of the wave, so you get a circular wave, and the amplitude of the wave, so how high the wave crest is, will also be the same in all directions. Whereas the bat with this megaphone, it will make sure that the wave crests in the front direction are much higher than the ones in the back, right? And so amplitude is indeed an important thing, right? So we don't hear bats, right? Because their frequencies are the ultrasonic range. People with a useful hearing, either who are young or who have retained a useful hearing, they can hear some bat species, right? So in humans, the ability to hear high frequencies, that goes down with age, right? So teenagers, they can hear much higher frequencies than people that are older than that. And the older you get, your high frequency hearing suffers the most, right? But people who either young or who have retained a useful hearing, they can hear beds that are sort of in the lower range of frequencies. But to us, it always sounds faint, right? So even if you can hear a bed, you hear probably the lower parts of the frequency spectrum, but you hear this faint tick, 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 tick. But what that deceives you, because beds are actually really loud, or many species or some species are. But then the idea is, right, because when sound propagates, you lose energy. You lose energy due to two effects, right? The first effect why you lose energy is because the air will turn part of the, so you push those molecules and they start rotating and do all kind of thing, right? So you lose energy into heat. And that's called
basically like friction, right?
Yeah,
sorry,
a bit like friction, right? And then the other effect is that, of course, as the further away you are, the surface area is bigger, right? So if you again think of a source that emits in all directions the same, right? So you are a meter away now, all the sound energy that you emit is distributed over the surface of a sphere with 1 meter radius. Right? If then you go 2 meters away, the energy is the same, right? The sound energy that you put into that pulse, that utterance, it hasn't changed. But now the surface of the sphere is the surface of a sphere with 2 meter radius, right? And then 5 meter radius and 10 meter radius, right? So you get this that's called geometric losses, right? So you have that, right? Then if you, this is a sonar, right? So the wave travels out, you have this loss due to absorption, you have this loss due to geometrical spreading losses, and now you hit a target, right? Say you hit a moth, right? That's a tiny little creature, right? So the cross section with which it can reflect the sound is also tiny, right? So now you lose from that, right? Most of the sound just goes to infinity, right? It never comes back to you. And only from that small cross section of the moth that you were looking at, this is coming back. But on the way back, the same thing happens, right? So again, you have absorption. Again, you have spreading losses, right? And then what's left after that comes to your ear, right? And of course, there's noise, right? And so on. So you really, it depends, but you have to pump a lot into on the input side of that channel, so that on the output side, you can still get something useful, right? And so beds can easily have, I think, 130, 140 decibels of decibel sound pressure level. Right? And it's not my field, but I've read a jet engine has 160 in a certain distance, probably a meter or something like that. I don't know which jet engine, so I'm not an expert, right? But so that would be a really loud sound, would be 160 decibels. So 20 decibels is a factor on the decibel is this logarithmic scale. So 20 decibels is a factor 10, right? So a bed that emits, and these are sort of the champions, the loudest recorded ever bed, right? 140 decibels. So that's 1/10 of a jet engine, right? And that's amazing, right? Because a jet engine, I don't know which type of jet engine, but even the small ones, right? They are very impressive machines, right? So, and they burn a lot of energy. There's a lot going on in there. And then imagining that a small bat, right? So I don't know which, maybe typical bat, right, of that, this species, maybe 10, 20 gram of body mass. So that can create a sound pressure level that is 1/10 of this gigantic jet engine. That is actually very impressive, right? So bats are really, or can be this species that use this, they can be really loud, right? And the reason being that you have this really harsh regimes when it comes to sound, right? And that's also an interesting comparison, right? If you look at cetaceans, right, toothed whales, dolphins, these animals that also use sonar, right? So there's two groups of sonar using main groups. There's some birds, but that's sort of on the side. There's two main groups of sonar using animals, right? It's the bats in the air, and then it is the toothed whales, dolphins in the water. And the bats clearly they were dealt the worst hand here when it comes to physics, right? Because sound travels much better in water than it does in air, right? So what the bats actually do is, right, if you look at bats, right, they tend to produce chirps, right? So you want to often what you want to do is you want to cover a lot of frequencies in what you emit. And it's like seeing the world with white light, many frequencies, but you can see much more detail in the world than if you when you have daylight, right, or white light, right? Then if you have only say, right, like you're in some kind of dark room and you have only red light or so, you see much less detail, right? So I mean, color differences, obviously. So there's this idea you want to make many different frequencies. And how do you do that, right? So the dolphins, with few exceptions, they tend to produce just like a little click, right? So they get a broad spectrum by just limiting their signal in time, right? So that's the Heisenberg the uncertainty principle, right? If you locate yourself very tightly in time, you spread yourself out in frequency, right? And that's what the toothed whales do, right? They say, okay, we just make a very short click, so we get all these frequencies, and that's possible. But although you cannot pick much energy into a signal like that, if your signal is short, you're peak limited, how much output you produce, so you cannot put much energy into that. And for the dolphins, that's okay, right? Because then in water, and water carries sound really, really well, right? So if you dive into a swimming pool, you go underwater, right? You hear a lot of things going on, right, from other swimmers and so on. So it carries the sound really, really well, right? But in air, the bats, they cannot do that, right? So most bats, they would actually chirp, right? So they go through the frequencies one by one and stretch the sound on over time so that they can pump out more energy. So that you can see how these two groups of animals really react to the physics of the medium, that the principle is the same, sonar, but they really react to the physical constraints of the medium that they are in.
I just looked up some rock concerts, like the really loud rock concerts are about 130 decibels. So
yep, like a loud rock concert then, yep.
Yeah, good. And let's stick with the power a little bit here as well. So when you turn up the volume on your TV, we think of that as sort of this like linear step, but those steps are actually moving up what we think of the decibel scale, right? And every tick mark on your volume is actually increasing it by an increasing rate, and the power is getting much more, right? So it's covering this incredible scale of power.
Yeah, it's a good thing, right? So every 20 decibels is a factor 10. And so if you look at the dynamic range of bat hearing, right? So these bats that we, for example, work with, we see them routinely emit under than 10 decibel sound pressure level. So decibel by itself is just relative, right? Decibel sound pressure level has a reference, so now it's an absolute number. And so they would emit something like 110 decibels. And then their sensitivity threshold is a lot like humans, right? So that's how 0 decibel sound pressure level, I mean, it has changed over time and a different definition, but it's sort of close to the softest sound that we can determine, right? That's 0 dB sound pressure. And that's also for bats, they're also in that neighborhood. Again, you know, what is a few decibels among friends, right? But you can imagine, right, that they have about 100 decibels dynamic range, right? And 100, that is it's 5 times 20, so it's 10 to the 5, 100,000, right? So the softest sound that the bats can deal with, and the highest amplitude sound that they can deal with is 5 orders of magnitude in between.
And so what does this correlate to in sort of real space? When we talk about like a 10 or 100 decibel thing, that's just a very small displacement for the wave. And then if we're talking 100 decibels, how big is that displacement?
Actually, you are asking me something that I don't know those numbers by heart. I don't know what, but I mean, all these things are actually, what I can tell you, it's probably very small. Okay. Right. So also energy wise, but I think I looked that up the other day. So for the really loud bat, right, in terms of watts, right? How many watts of energy is it actually? And if I'm not mistaken, so again, I cannot do that calculation on the back of the envelope while we are chatting here. I think it was a few hundred milliwatts.
Okay.
Right. So a sound that, so you think, right? So, if you put a sound, I think that was already, I think a sound that would make you deaf for life, that was 400 milliwatts of power. Right. So sound is really tiny amounts of energy, but it can have huge effects. And that is because our ears are really these super finely tuned machines, right, where we can hear, but it's, I mean, our hearing threshold, that's sort of the Brownian motion of air, right? So we couldn't go much further, but our hearing system is tuned. But if you look at this part of the inner ear, right, that processes the input of the sound, but there's virtually no blood vessels in that part. But then the reason being, right, if you had blood vessels, there would be flow noise from the blood going through. But so that whole organ is optimized to really go to the very physical limit of what you perceive, right? So that system is all made for that, and that's true for not just for bats, right? What that is hearing specialist, but it's also true for humans.
Wow. Okay. So yeah. So basically, you don't want to be hearing noise all the time. Your ears don't want to be that sensitive.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. Good. You talked about how sound waves dissipate over time. I was wondering if you could talk about how that changes with different frequencies. The way it's salient for me to understand is if you hear thunder. If you're close, it sounds like a really bright, loud bang, and if you're off in the distance, it sounds like this low sort of rumbling, and it's a very different sort of sound, right? And then tied into that, we can. I don't know if it's just that principle that lets us understand how far away objects or sound producing objects are, but or just so could you tie in those ideas of like how sound wave travels through air in terms of frequencies and how we are basically able to locate sound in space, or at least distance to start?
Yeah, so indeed, and this effect that you hear when you listen to the thunder from hopefully a comfortable distance far away, or if it's uncomfortably close, that is this part. So I mentioned there's two factors that account for loss if sound travels through the air, right? One is the geometrical loss, that you just take the same sound energy and you distribute it over larger and larger surfaces. But that is frequency independent, right? It's the same for all frequencies, right? If you go from a sphere with 1 meter radius to a sphere with 10 meter radius, it doesn't matter what frequency you are in. If you look at the absorption, the other term, that depends on frequency. And it's interestingly, so the higher the frequency, the stronger this absorption, and the relationship is square. So if you have 10 times the frequency, you get 100 times the absorption, right? So bat ultrasound, it goes maybe to around 200 kilohertz, right? There's somewhere there, maybe some a little bit higher. That's about where it ends. And the reason is probably if you go to higher frequencies, right? So if you had a bat with megahertz biosonar frequencies, right, it could barely see the hand in front of its own nose. And that's probably the reason for that. So that is the question of how sound decays, the amplitude decays with distance. And in the very beginning, when people started to look into how spatial hearing works, for instance, bats, right, the idea was, wouldn't bats use that, right? So if you hear a soft sound and if you hear a loud sound, right, so can you say, oh yeah, that has traveled a longer distance? But the problem is that you don't know the target, right? So what people call the target strength, right? So how much energy does the target reflect? So again, I mentioned there's this sonar channel, right, where the sound, I emit a sound, it travels out through the air. So now I'm losing energy through absorption and through geometric spreading losses. Now it hits a target. The target has a certain strength. It only returns part of what I put in. And then again, I have these spreading losses on the way back. So the unknown in that, so I have two unknowns. I have
the unknown of distance, and I have the unknown of the strength of my target. So how much of the acoustic energy that I put in does it return, right? And so I have just one equation, but I know the amplitude or the amplitude drop. I know what I emitted. I know what I got back. So I know the drop in amplitude. So I have one known and two unknowns. And that is a situation that you don't want to be in, right? Because you can, if you know nothing else, solving for two unknowns from one known, that's never going to work, right? So that's why bats don't rely on amplitude when they tell distance. Again, you could look relative at frequencies, right? And I think that's something that but so you can say, so what happens to the high frequencies relative to the low frequencies, right? If I know my spectrum, and indeed, but I think I'm maybe making that up, but I think that is actually true that humans would think that sounds that, or we would tend to associate sounds that are deeper in pitch, right, that tend to contain more lower frequencies. We would think of them as coming from further away than sounds that are sort of more broadband, right? So if you have this crack of thunder, but it startles you probably more because your brain thinks this is really close by, right? Whereas if you hear this grumbling of the thunder from a large distance, it doesn't startle you that much because the brain thinks something that is that low frequency is probably far away. But you have to make an assumption what the spectrum is, right? Because if the source that produces just a low frequency is right next to you, right? If it is just the spectral shape of the source. So, but for the bats, it's actually pretty well established. What they use to tell distance is the acoustic time of flight, right? So when they emit the ultrasonic pulse, they start the timer and they count how long does it take until the echo returns. And then knowing the speed of sound, you can then easily solve for the distance.
I see. So that makes sense to me that just hearing a sound, you can make certain assumptions because we talked about basically the power scale. And so those really high frequencies, they're going to filter out very quickly. So I've seen videos of humans that can echolocate. And I was wondering if they use the same sort of thing. And people, if they're listening, they can try this on their own too. If you close your eyes and you put something in front of your mouth and make a sound and then move it further away, or if you have somebody move it like in and out of your field of sound production there, you can kind of tell when something's there, when something's not, how far away it is. So do humans don't use this sort of timing mechanism at all, I would think, but we can hear distances that we can kind of like some exceptional people can use sound that they produce in the same way that bats do to locate objects as well.
Yeah, so the sonar engineers, they tend to classify sonar into two top-level categories. So they like to think of active sonar and passive sonar. So active sonar is the sonar where I produce a pulse and then I listen for the echoes and compare the pulse to the echo. And passive sonar is if there's a source of sound somewhere else and I just listen to what comes to my ear. Right? So I think humans do a lot of passive sonar. Right? So we really, you know, the rooms that we are in, right? Imagine you sit in a, often we don't realize that, right? But say you sit in a living room with a person, right? And so imagine what is the response of the room, right? Not much, right? So the living room, you have typically curtains and things like that that absorb sound, right? So so if you look and compare, you know, the two people sit on the sofa, they're chatting in the living room, what actually arrives at your ear. And then you go with the same person and you go and you chat in the cathedral if you're allowed to do that, right? So now you have a cathedral is much larger than the living room. The surfaces are usually marble or other stones, really hard reflective surfaces. You get this really reverberant space, right? Lots of reflections, reverberation. And there's something that we usually don't notice that much, right? But because we can understand speech under different conditions, we can even recognize speakers, right? So if you have a familiar speaker, you can recognize their voice, although it sounds very different, right? So if you try to train a computer, an AI program or so, to recognize a speaker under different circumstances, sound recorded in a living room, sound recorded in the cathedral, it's going to have difficulties. And our hearing system, our brain is very good at that. So we do actually a lot of passive sonar, and if it is only to get rid of all that stuff and focus on the content of the speech, right? So I'm not surprised. I mean, everything, right, is, if you look at capabilities, right, that the brain, that the hearing system has, is always quite fascinating. But I'm not so surprised that humans, when they try their ears at echolocation, that they can do many things, right? And so because the passive sonar is part of our life, right, telling from spectral differences, right, and so on, that's very common. And people can also learn to, as far as I know, right, can learn to use active sonar. So again, this is not my field, but I've heard that blind people, they like to wear shoes that make noise when walking, right? And so the noise from their own walking, right, sounds when their shoes are clicking on the ground or whatever kind of sound is being made there, they can use that, right, and make inferences about their environment, right? And there's people that use sound sources, right, have like a loudspeaker that they carry with them. They can do an amazing amount of recognizing objects, recognizing geometric relationships, just by listening to the echoes. So it's not that a bat does something that is completely foreign to a human. Humans can also learn that and are able of amazing feats.
Okay, interesting. So if these high frequencies decay very fast through space, why then are they using these high frequencies, right?
Yeah, I mean, they are trapped, right? So I think on the one side, right, so there's a question: what determines the lowest frequency that a bat uses, right? And there's two things, right? So one thing is maybe the targets, right? If the targets are small, you get a really nice reflection if the wavelength is not too large, right? So when the wavelength becomes larger than the target that it reflects, it, right, then very quickly you come to a reflection region that is called the lamp region. And no, the lamp region is below that. Then you come to the Rayleigh region, excuse me. The Rayleigh region, the strength of the target, so how much is reflected of what you put in, that goes down with the fourth power of the wavelength, right? So you want to stay away from that, right? So that calls, if say a bat feeds on a certain size of moth or on a certain size of beetle, right? So you don't want to be in that region, in this lamp, in this, say it again, in this Rayleigh region, because you really get very little energy back. You want to be in the specular region, or in between there's this me region, right, where it's sort of, it's a bit chaotic, but it goes up and down how much you get back, but you get quite a bit. You get quite a bit of your energy back there. So that's one reason. Then also there's a lot of noise in the low frequency ranges, right? So I do a lot of listening to bats in the tropical rainforest. And so if you're in the tropical rainforest in the night, right, there's frogs, there's insects, right? And so if you record, then broadband do recordings, right? This whole lower band, right, 5, 10, 15, 20, 25 kilohertz, right, that's all completely crowded, right? But if you go to 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80 kilohertz, right, that's a frequency band. Anything that you have there is a bat. So in a way they have specialized, just like, when the government sells frequencies, right, for radio and wireless communication, cell phone networks, and so on. So you get your frequency band. So scattering from small objects and being away from all those other noisy
transmitters, right? That's probably what pushed the bed up. But then, as you pointed out, right, when you get to the really high frequencies, then they get stung by this second power relationship, and that's probably why the party doesn't go on, right? Why they're really trapped in this band. So I think the lowest beds, they start somewhere a few single-digit kilohertz, right? And then it goes to maybe a bit more than 200 kilohertz for the highest species, and that's probably the region that they are confined to, because at the lower end things don't work out so well, but at the higher end they don't work out so well either.
Interesting. And I tuned into the different scattering you were talking about. I've only ever heard that in the context of light and particles before. But that's, I guess that's interesting that that's a fundamental
it's waves,
property
right?
of waves.
So with waves, you always have these three regions: a specular region, a Mie region, where you have sort of like an up and down, depending on what's the exact relationship of wavelengths to scatter diameter. And then you have this Rayleigh region where it goes down with the fourth power.
Okay. And then, so distance is one part spatially that we understand, and then we can also kind of orient it, locate, find a direction. This is really hard for me to understand, but the only thing I do know is I did a little experiment where if you close one ear and close your eyes, it's really difficult to kind of figure out where things are. So my understanding is that it's largely based on having two ears, but maybe there's something else you can do. So I find this very interesting.
Yeah,
that you can
it is
find spatially sound.
so telling the direction of a sound source is actually a really interesting topic, and we've actually just last year published a paper on a completely new principle how to actually do that. So it has been around for a long time, but there's still new things to discover. So for humans, we use different mechanisms depending on whether we want to localize a sound in the horizontal. So is it left or is it right? And in the vertical. So if you want to decide whether it's up or straight ahead or below, right? Does it come from above or does it come from below? We use a different mechanism than when we want to decide, does it come from the left or does it come from the right? Right. So when it is about whether the sound comes from the left or the right, we compare our two ears, right? So you can imagine if a sound source is to my right, the sound will arrive at my right ear earlier, and it will also be louder on my right ear than it will be on my left ear. And so our brains have special circuits, and they are wired to compare what's coming in on the right ear, what's coming in on the left ear, and these circuits translate that difference in an estimate for an angle where the sound is coming from on the left-hand side, or from the left-hand side to the right-hand side. So for sounds that differ in the vertical, right? Imagine you have a sound that is positioned left, right on the midline. Right, so there is no difference between left and right ear, and now I'm moving it up or I'm moving it down. So the fact that I have two ears for determining that, it's useless, right? So now I need a different mechanism that can tell me whether the sound is up or whether the sound is down, right? And so that's where the shape of our ears come in, right? So if you look at your own ears or feel your own ears, you can feel, right, that there are these funny grooves and I don't know, ridges on the ear, right? And what is that for? That's exactly for that, right? Because what you will get is you will get a complicated diffraction process. So the sound comes in from the outside environment, but it hits your outer ear, the pinna, where you have all this geometric complexity, and then from there it is diffracted into the ear canal, and then it goes to your tympanic membrane, and then you eventually perceive that sound. And because your ear shape is so complicated, it will pass some frequencies better than others, right? So this diffraction process will work well for some frequencies, but not for other. But that will also depend on direction. So in our case, direction in the vertical. So in other words, the sound gets colored, right? So a sound that comes from 30 degrees above, right, has a different spectral color because certain frequencies are attenuated and others are transmitted better than a sound that comes from 30 degree below or 20 degree below. So it's an elevation dependent filtering, and that tells you where the sound is coming from in the vertical.
Okay. And do we have to make assumptions like we did with the distance because we don't know the frequency or the
so
spectrum?
you can be fooled, right? So if I play your sound over a speaker, so we probably assume more or less that the sounds that we are listening to, they are white, right? So their spectrum is flat. And so you can fool people, right? So I think there's a characteristic notch, spectral notch somewhere that certain frequencies are more or less, or are very heavily attenuated in a small region, right? And so if you take, say, speech or music, and you filter it and you put that notch on there and you transmit it to a listener via headsets, right? You cheat that person and the person will think that the sound is coming from somewhere above, when in reality it's just coming out of the headset and they are being cheated with location. Yes, so this is a very good observation. We make an assumption that these spectral features that our outer ear produces, they are not in the spectral characteristics of the source.
Okay, cool. And so our ears are perceiving all these nuances of the sound and interpreting it all at once. It's pretty incredible.
So we think, right, that hearing is all about speech recognition and that stuff, but there's a lot of things going on, right? There's where the sound is coming from, what kind of environment are we in? Is there a lot of reverberation? Is there little reverberation? And our hearing system deals with that, but it deals with it below subconsciously, right? Below the level of our conscience. So we don't consciousness, right? So we do not realize that all that stuff is going on.
Good. Okay. Can we move on to the mechanics and the biology anatomy of the ear?
Yeah, sure.
Because I'm sure you have a very good understanding of this, trying to replicate it in some of your work, right? So we talked a little bit about the outer ear, but that's kind of a straightforward structure, you know, everyone can see it. Inside it gets incredibly complex, right? I've looked at pictures of it and it seems like this highly specialized organ. And so could you just sort of explain the function of it, how the different parts work and how they go together?
Yeah, so the function of the inner ear is so at the input you have a wave inside the ear. It is inside the inner ear, it's a fluid, right? So you have a wave that it comes from the middle ear. That's the function of the middle ear, right? That you go from air as a medium to fluid as a medium, but and that boundary is actually hard, right? So if you submerge yourself in the pool, right, and then people are speaking outside in the air, you don't hear much from that, right? You have very good sound propagation within the water, but from air to water, that's not so good, right? So the middle ear is really the device that makes that, it's called an impedance match, right? So between air and fluid. So inside your inner ear, you have still a sound that travels in a fluid, in a liquid, this case, not a gas anymore, a liquid. And the name of the game here is twofold. So one is you want to translate that sound into a different modality, into electrical impulses that the brain uses as its language. And then you also want to do a frequency analysis, right? So you want to split the sound that is coming in into the different frequencies, right? So the inner ear is a clever little mechanical machine that is made to accomplish these two functions, right? This conversion from fluid wave to electricity, and then this analysis in terms of frequencies. And the way the frequency analysis works is that you have there's inside your inner ear, there is a sort of really complicated geometry with a membrane that is this looks like a snail, right? So it has is wound up, goes through a couple of windings, and it is made so that different frequencies, they will make this thing vibrate. And the maximum amplitude of the vibration will be in a different place depending on what the frequency of the incoming signal is, right? So along this membrane, right, the high frequencies will vibrate strongest on one end, and the low frequencies will vibrate strongest on the other end of this membrane, right? So you get this purely this split in frequency, right? There's no sort of computation, no signal processing in the computational computer on brain domain. It is purely mechanical, right? So there's a mechanical machine that is set up so that it splits the incoming sound into different frequency channels, right? And so then, and the next step is what you want to do is you want to turn that vibration of the membrane into an electrical signal. So that's the second part that has to happen there. And that happens because you have cells on that membrane, and any biological cell is like a little battery, right? So it has there's an electrical potential between the inside and the outside of a cell, and that's actually universal. All cells, or at least all that I know of, maybe there's somewhere there's an exception, but that's something that's either all cells have it or almost all cells have it. And so so you have this electrical potential over the cell membrane, and now you can have little gaps, little openings, channels in the cell membrane that can let charged particles, ions, travel either into the cell or out of the cell. And so what the vibration of this membrane does through some mechanical process, what it does is it modulates these openings in the cell membrane, right? So the flow of the ions get changed, and so with that changes the electrical potential inside or across the membrane of the cell, and that creates then an electrical signal that is then conveyed eventually. Again, there's always when two cells talk to each other, there's typically a change in the modality that the signal goes from electrical inside the cell to chemical between cells and then electrical again. And that just keeps going until you perceive that sound.
Okay. So our ears are not like a microphone. They don't take the whole signal and translate it into sort of one waveform,
Yep.
right? It translates everything spatially, and then your brain is able to pick up these signals from all different parts of your ear and kind of understand the nature of the sound based on that spatial. Great. And then are bat ears pretty fundamentally the same mechanically as human ears?
Yes. So at the very fundamental, the devil is in the details, right? But at the very fundamental level, yes. So I mean, we are mammals and bats are mammals, and so there's a lot of similarity. And actually, the reason why I became interested in bats in the very beginning was because at the time, so I was interested in how hearing works, and at the time, bats were a model system for that, right? Because in bats, the hearing part of the brain is proportional. Bats have tiny brains, right? So in a typical bat, the whole brain is just less than a gram, right? So it's a tiny thing there, but the hearing part is actually proportionally very large, and so it was very good for the initial work to deal with that. But a lot of the sophisticated techniques that we have today to study the brain, back then they were not developed to the same extent that they are today. So it really made sense to work with bats. So bats were a model system where people had done a lot of work. And so if you were interested in hearing, it was kind of natural to work with bats, right? That was the model organism to consider, right? And so again, on the small scale, if you look direct about obviously adaptation to higher frequencies and so on. So there, particularly if you look at the mechanics,
how exactly things are dimensioned in the bat ear. There's quite a few differences from humans, but the basic principles are the same.
Okay. So we don't move our ears to listen very much. They're just kind of fixed to our head, but a lot of animals move them around and they can, you know, focus on different areas. I read something that bats will twitch their ears in response to a sound to get some Doppler effects and try and understand that. I don't know if that's accepted or, but that's an incredible ability if they can do that.
Yeah, so that's our research, right? And I think it is sound. I don't know if it's generally accepted. I'm convinced, but you're always convinced about your own results. But what is accepted, right? So we are sort of standard mammals when it comes to our outer ears, right? Our pinna, in that, you know, they hang on the side of the head and they do nothing. We have 4 muscles that connect our outer ears to the skull. And some people can use, and some people, they have, funnily, they have control over these muscles, and these people can wiggle their ears, right? So they can shift the ears. Some can do it a little bit, some can do it a lot. I cannot do it at all. It doesn't probably matter because we're doing a podcast, so nobody would be able to see it anyway if I did it. But that's it, right? So 4 muscles that connect the pinna to the skull. Bats that do these kind of ear motions, they have around 20 muscles on each ear. And many of those muscles, the whole muzzle sits on the outer ear. So if a muzzle like that, right, where the muzzle sits on the ear in its entirety, if these muscles contract, the shape of your ear will change. Right? And that's what these bats do. And they can do that very quickly, right? So these bats, typically they completely maybe contract their ear by about 1/4 or so of the size within 1/10 of a second. But I've looked in a physiology textbook and I found that a human blink of an eye, it said, takes 3/10 of a second. So that means the bat can completely reconfigure the shape of its ears in 3 times as fast as you can blink your eyes, right? And so that's an amazing thing that is going on that we don't have in our hearing, but that we have been able to show that it really results in additional encoding of sensory information about the environment, right? So that is something that I've been looking at for quite some time. And so one thing that we discovered just about 3 years ago is that these motions of the bat ears, they are fast enough so that the sound, that I mentioned, that the sound that comes in, it's diffracted by the outer ear, and then it goes into the ear canal. That is true for us, and that is true for bats. What is different between those bat species and us is that the surface of the outer ear can actually move quickly while it is diffracting the sound. So the echo is coming in, it's being diffracted by the surface of the ear is in motion. So now you get this Doppler shift. That's a Doppler shift, again, for those people who don't deal with that every day. But so Doppler shift means that a wave is either compressed or dilated because there's relative motion between the receiver and the emitter. Right? So if you imagine you stand on the beach and you watch the ocean waves hit there, maybe you stand in the water, right, and you can count how the ocean waves hit your legs. Right, so if you stand, right, they come at a certain frequency at a certain time interval. But if you decide to run into the surf, right, so the wave crests, they will hit your legs at higher intervals, right, and that's a positive Doppler shift, right? Or you could run away from them, and then they would hit you at longer intervals, right? That would be a negative Doppler shift. And so the same thing happens with the bat ear, and then what that means is that the bats, the sound that enters their ear canal actually has a Doppler shift that was created by the motion of their own ears. And that is very interesting if we go back to those 2 principles for telling the direction of the sound that I alluded to earlier. Right? So this idea that we tell sound in the horizontal by using 2 ears. Right? So we compare which ear gets the sound first, on which ear is the sound louder,
And that you can do, so if you have 2 ears, you can do that with just sound of one frequency, right? So you can determine that. So you can tell the direction of a sound if you use one frequency and multiple, in this case, 2 receivers, or if you do what we do in the vertical, right, you can do away with one receiver, but you need multiple frequencies, right, because you need to see how the shape of your ear actually changes the sound depending on frequency. If you look at the bats with their Doppler shift, right, so the ear, right, it's not a uniform motion, right? It's not like the ear is uniformly flying towards the sound or flying away from the sound, but the ear, it's sort of deforming. So you have all kinds of directions of motion relative to the direction that the sound travels in. And the Doppler shift depends on that, right? That's when an ambulance passes you by, or a car that makes some noise, but when it's far away, you get a high, in front of you, you get a high-pitched sound, right? The Doppler shift goes like this, right? Because when it's far away, the direction of motion of the car is towards you, so you get a positive Doppler shift. When the car is right to your side, right, so the direction of motion of the car and the direction that the sound travels from the car to you, they are 90 degrees, they're perpendicular. So now you're not getting that compression or dilation of the wave. And then when the car is behind you, now you are dilating the waves, right? So that's also happening in the ear with a different part of the ear. They're moving in different directions. So you don't get one Doppler shift, you get a whole Doppler pattern. And so what we could show is that with these Doppler patterns, even if you just emit a single frequency, or you just have a single frequency to work with, because you get this complicated Doppler pattern, you can actually tell the direction of a sound using just one frequency and one receiver. And previously, right, there were only these 2 paradigms. Either you had multiple receivers and one frequency if you wanted to, or you had multiple frequencies and just one receiver if you wanted to. And now we could show, no, if you do things the bad way, you can actually tell the direction of a sound using just one receiver and one frequency.
I could see where that would be useful to the bat if they're trying to locate a reflected wave and there's not many options for that wave frequency to reflect back, as we talked about. I can see where you would want to key in on that frequency and be able to manipulate it to understand. Interesting. And also they must be able to move theirs quite fast, as you said, because the speed of sound is really fast, right? And if you want to create a shift, you have to.
Doppler shift depends on the ratio of the speed of sound and the speed that you move with, right? So you really, I mean, it also depends on the frequency, right? So so you want to have a high frequency and then have a velocity that, you know, is not too, I mean, it doesn't have to be close to the speed of sound, but it's not negligible compared to the speed of sound.
Mm-hmm. And that makes me think of something too related to the speed. So if they use sonar to pick up to find things to eat, so they need to identify the location of insects at very, very small intervals. Basically, you know, they need to find something in a matter of inches if they're going to go snag it. So that seems incredible to me as well, that they can have that fine tune of a timing to get the distance to an insect at the speed of sound, traveling at, you know, just maybe a foot or, you know, inches, right?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Cool.
That's right.
So they can. Okay. So that's just something awesome that they can do.
Oh yes, it is. Yeah. It's all, they live in a very fast-paced world when they are on the wing and tracking their prey.
Okay. Great. I think that's all the questions I have for the science part. Did you want to talk about some of your research? Because so you're in the engineering department, so you actually try and replicate and build some of these mechanical devices and structures, right? Do you want to talk about sort of the approach you have for doing that, and I guess why you would want to do things like that?
Yeah, I have 2 labs actually, and one lab is dedicated to building robots based on bats, and that's here at Virginia Tech, so in Blacksburg, Virginia. And then the other lab is for looking at the actual bats, and that is on the island of Borneo, where there's a lot of bats that live in dense rainforest, mangrove, heath forest, right? This kind of really complex natural environment that you have in a tropical country like that. and for me, that is very important, right? To actually look at the animals ourselves. So there's a lot of like this whole area of bio-inspired engineering, right? That you see, we want to create technology that is inspired by solutions that we find in nature, right? That's a really hot area, and there's a lot of people working in that. But if you look at it, a lot of people who do this kind of work, it's really just a loose inspiration, right? So they see maybe some documentary on television, and then they're inspired by what they see. But what I think is, if you really want to make some fundamental progress, you need to dig deeper, right? You really need to look at your biological model system. In our case, it's the bat, but it could be something else, and really push the envelope. What do we understand what's going on? And so I find that very rewarding, right? That in the technology development that we are doing, we actually also have access. So I like this, in the past summer, I was a total of 16 Virginia Tech students, or no, 16 US students, not all from Virginia Tech, were in Borneo. And so that is really nice, right? That these students have the ability to actually work with the animals, observe them, record them, and get a sense what's going on there, and then come back to the lab here and work on their robots.
Okay, that's a good message for people who are thinking about what to do if they want to go places to study things in nature. There's room for physicists and engineers to do that.
Yep, there's room for
stuck in a
physics
lab.
in the rainforest. There's a lot of that going on. And I mean, we have a lab there, so we look at the bats outside, but we also have a really nicely instrumented lab. But we have a flight tunnel with 50 high-speed video cameras where we record the bats, but they can make these amazing ninja moves when they fly through obstacle arrays, right? And so we record their motions with 50 high-speed video cameras, and we record their sound with currently 32 ultrasonic microphones. We want to extend that to 48 ultrasonic microphones, but so we can actually do very quantitative science, but collect a lot of data, terabytes of data, right, on what the bats do. But we can, we can go to the forest and we can take a bat that catches insects in dense vegetation, or carnivorous bats that goes after mice and things like that, and bring them to the lab and see what they are doing, right? And so that's really an amazing opportunity, right? So the island of Borneo has about 100 known species of bats, I believe. And the US, if I remember correctly, the number is 17. So the closer you come to the equator, the more species you have, the more options you have to compare what's going on, and how these differences between species, what their relevance may be.
Good. I feel like I say this every podcast to the scientists that I'm interviewing, is that sort of the fundamental thing in science is quantification. It's great to explain all these phenomena that we're doing, but to really prove and understand it, we need data, we need math, we need to quantify all these things.
That is very true.
Yeah, great. Okay. Is there anything else you want to talk about? Any projects that you have that you want to promote? That's all the questions I have.
I think though that's about, I think, well, we covered a lot of ground, and again, maybe I could say, right, what we want to do with that stuff, because I explained our approach, right, that we want to study bats and we want to build robots, and really the holy grail for this research is that we want to be able to become autonomous in complex natural environments, right? So bats, they can navigate, they can find their food at night in a dense rainforest using only listening to sound. And that's what that's my career dream, right? I want a drone that can accomplish that, right? So, and I think bats use an approach that is fundamentally, because it's based on sonar, and this happens in these really complicated environments, but the bat at any time, right, is surrounded by thousands of little facets that reflect sound, right? So how can you actually be autonomous in such a world, right, based on sound, right? That is sort of the most fundamental research question that we face and that we want to learn from the bats how they do it, and then we want to test our understanding by doing it ourselves, right? So we are taking our bat robots to Borneo in the summer, take them into the forest, take them into our flight tunnel, and see how far away we are still from the bat. And the answer is, yeah, we understand some things, but we are really still far from those animals. But hopefully in the next couple of years, we are going to make headway there.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for your time.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's really a
Yeah.
pleasure.